Throughout history, Africa has been the target of the most dangerous lies. Lies crafted to strip its people of dignity, erase their brilliance, and justify centuries of exploitation. But what if I told you these myths were deliberately constructed to control the narrative? In this video, we'll uncover the truth behind the greatest lies ever told about Africans, and how these falsehoods have shaped the world's perception of Africa for centuries. Stick around until the end, because the seventh lie will shock you and change everything you thought you knew. So, sit back, because this is Africa Unveiled. Before we dive in, I know many of you are watching from around the world, united by a love for Africa. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I'll be in the comments engaging with you. And if you're enjoying the content, a like and subscription would truly mean the world to me. All right, let's get back to the video. For centuries, the myth that Africans sold other Africans into slavery has been used to blame African people for one of history's greatest atrocities. This narrative, perpetuated through textbooks, media, and even some historical accounts, places the responsibility of the transatlantic slave trade solely on the shoulders of Africans. But this distortion is not only historically inaccurate, it's dangerous. It deflects attention from the true culprits and oversimplifies a complex and tragic story. The roots of this myth can be traced back to European colonial powers, who sought to avoid responsibility for their role in the transatlantic slave trade. By casting Africans as both the victims and perpetrators of slavery, they shifted the blame from themselves to the very people they were exploiting. This narrative allowed Europeans to distance themselves from the violence and cruelty of the system they created, effectively erasing their direct role in the destruction of African societies. In reality, the transatlantic slave trade was a system driven by European powers, who exploited Africa's people for profit. Rather than Africans selling their own into slavery, Europeans created a marketplace through coercion, manipulation, and violence. Armed with advanced weaponry, European traders frequently incited wars between African tribes, exacerbating existing conflicts and creating opportunities to capture and enslave people. They often made deals with local African rulers, offering guns, alcohol, and other goods in exchange for enslaved individuals. This approach wasn't rooted in mutual collaboration. It was rooted in domination. Many African leaders, faced with overwhelming European pressure, had little choice but to participate in the slave trade. These leaders were often caught in a trap where resisting the Europeans meant risking the destruction of their own communities. The real question is not why some African leaders participated, but rather why European powers, who had the military and economic power, were so intent on exploiting Africa in the first place. What's often overlooked in the Africans selling Africans myth is the stark difference between African systems of servitude and the brutal chattel slavery introduced by Europeans. Before the arrival of the transatlantic slave trade, some African societies did practice forms of servitude, but these systems were fundamentally different. African forms of servitude often allowed for mobility, reintegration into society, and even opportunities for freedom. By contrast, the system imposed by Europeans was racially based, dehumanizing, and permanent. The nature of the transatlantic slave trade created a cycle of violence that was largely orchestrated by Europeans. Rather than simply buying slaves from Africans, European traders incited conflict and division, using existing rivalries to their advantage. They created a system in which African people were captured from their own communities or from neighboring tribes, then sold into a brutal, unending cycle of exploitation. The selling of slaves was not a voluntary transaction, but the result of a complex web of violence and coercion. In many instances, the Africans involved in the slave trade were also victims. They were often forced to trade prisoners of war, captives, or even their own people, because they had no other option. European traders used threats, manipulation, and economic power to enforce participation in the system, often framing it as a means of survival. But this was never a matter of choice for the African people involved. It was a matter of powerlessness in the face of overwhelming European aggression. What this myth does is obscure the true origins of the slave trade. It allows European colonial powers to avoid the consequences of their actions and paints Africans as complicit in their own oppression. By suggesting that Africans willingly participated in selling their own people, the narrative shields the real perpetrators, the European powers, who orchestrated and benefited from the entire system. The system of slavery was not an African invention, but a brutal European export designed to exploit African labor for the enrichment of European nations. For centuries, African people were painted as primitive, a narrative used to justify exploitation and domination. This myth claimed that Africa was a blank slate that needed to be civilized by Europeans. But when colonizers arrived, they didn't find an empty canvas. They found thriving civilizations, advanced cultures, and knowledge that had been flourishing long before Europeans set foot on the continent. The myth of African primitiveness was carefully constructed to dehumanize and erase the achievements of Africa's people, turning them into objects to be controlled and exploited. Let's take a moment to look at the civilizations that had been thriving for centuries before Europeans even knew Africa existed. Ancient Egypt, one of the world's greatest civilizations, was a pioneer in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The Great Pyramids were built with techniques that still baffle modern engineers. Egypt's scientific knowledge was foundational to the development of Western science and philosophy. The Mali Empire, with its vast wealth and cultural influence, was a beacon of learning long before European universities existed. Timbuktu, a major center of education, housed libraries and universities that rivaled anything Europe had at the time. Mali's prosperity wasn't just in gold, it was in knowledge, arts, and governance. In the Kingdom of Axum, Africa had one of the greatest trading empires of the ancient world. Connected to both Europe and Asia, Axum was a significant player in global trade and the spread of Christianity across Africa. The truth is, Africa was never the dark continent that colonizers claimed. It was a land of immense cultural and intellectual wealth. The myth that Africans were primitive was a tool designed to justify their exploitation and erasure. It's a lie that has been passed down for centuries, but it's time we reject it. Africa has always been a cradle of innovation, leadership, and wisdom. The next lie we will expose is equally destructive: the myth that Africa is a continent defined by poverty. But when we peel back the layers of colonialism and modern-day exploitation, we'll see that the true reason for Africa's struggles lies not in inherent poverty, but in the theft of its resources. Let's explore how this lie has kept the world from recognizing Africa's true economic potential. The myth that Africa is a poor continent didn't originate from the people of Africa. It was a narrative carefully constructed by colonial powers to justify exploitation. During the colonial era, European countries stripped Africa of its resources, gold, diamonds, oil, and more, without leaving anything in return. Africa wasn't poor, it was made poor. Wealth was siphoned off, and economies were destroyed. Artificial borders were drawn, ignoring ethnic and cultural realities, and colonial powers left behind broken systems that were never meant to succeed. Today, the extraction of Africa's natural wealth continues, as multinational corporations and foreign governments continue to exploit the continent's resources with little regard for the well-being of African people. Now let's set the record straight. Africa is rich. It is one of the wealthiest continents in terms of natural resources. Africa holds about 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including precious metals like gold, diamonds, and cobalt, the latter essential for modern technologies like smartphones and electric cars. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Libya sit on vast oil reserves, which have powered economies worldwide for decades. Yet, despite all this wealth, Africa remains labeled as poor. How is that possible? The reason many African countries still face economic struggles isn't due to a lack of resources, but because of external exploitation and, in some cases, internal mismanagement. Colonial powers didn't leave Africa with a legacy of prosperity. They left behind fractured economies, artificial borders, and governments struggling with corruption and debt. After colonial powers left, they did so without giving Africa the tools needed for true independence. Today, foreign corporations continue to extract resources at the expense of local economies, with little reinvestment in African communities. Despite all of this, Africa is far from being defined by poverty. The continent is home to some of the most innovative, resilient people on the planet. Entrepreneurs in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa are leading the way in technology, with Africa boasting one of the fastest-growing tech sectors in the world. Mobile banking and e-commerce are transforming African economies, attracting international investors and startups. Local communities are coming up with sustainable solutions to address food security, climate change, and water scarcity. Solar energy projects in rural villages and urban farming initiatives are reshaping the future of African agriculture. Africa's cultural influence has also exploded on the global stage. Afrobeats, Nollywood, and African fashion are now worldwide phenomena, reshaping global culture and putting African creativity at the forefront. From music to film, Africa is now a global leader in cultural exports. So, why is Africa still portrayed as a continent of poverty? The world continues to ignore Africa's true potential, choosing instead to focus on a narrative of despair. Africa is not poor. It is a continent rich in resources, culture, and innovation. Its struggles are the result of centuries of exploitation and mismanagement. The true wealth of Africa has yet to be fully realized, but the time is coming when the world will see Africa for what it truly is, a continent of infinite potential. The next myth we'll tackle is one that has caused irreparable harm to African identity: the idea that Africans are savage and inherently violent. This stereotype was constructed to justify colonial violence and continues to influence perceptions of Africa today. But the truth is, Africa has a rich history of peace, diplomacy, and leadership that has been systematically erased from the global narrative. Let's explore this further. The savage stereotype wasn't a reflection of African life. It was a tool used to dehumanize African people and strip them of their agency. By depicting Africans as violent and uncivilized, colonizers could rationalize their actions, decimating communities, destroying cultures, and looting resources. They portrayed Africa as a land of warring tribes, an image designed to justify the imposition of foreign rule and the creation of artificial borders that disregarded Africa's ethnic and cultural realities. But history tells a different story. Many African societies were built on traditions of peace, diplomacy, and effective governance, a reality that contradicts the violent narrative of savagery. Take the Akan Empire in present-day Ghana. Their system of governance was based on consensus and democracy, not brutality. Leaders were chosen for wisdom and the ability to unite people, making the Akan Empire a flourishing center of trade and culture. Similarly, the Kingdom of Benin in modern-day Nigeria was known for its highly organized governance, urban planning, and diplomatic relations with European nations long before colonization began. Even in instances of warfare, the focus wasn't on mindless violence, but strategic unity. Shaka Zulu, often seen through the lens of military conquest, used strategic brilliance and discipline to build a powerful empire based on respect for the community, not chaos. His military reforms prioritized unity and strength, showing that African leaders valued collective well-being, even in times of conflict. The savage myth was a deliberate tool to mask the true violence committed by European powers during colonization. It justified atrocities like the Atlantic slave trade, where millions of Africans were kidnapped, enslaved, and sold across the world, all under the false pretense of Africa's inherent savagery. The scramble for Africa, when European powers carved up the continent in the late 19th century without regard for ethnic or cultural boundaries, was another act of violence, excused by this myth. Even in colonial concentration camps, where Africans suffered unimaginable conditions, the colonizers framed their actions as civilizing missions, bringing order to the so-called chaos of Africa. This narrative enabled colonizers to commit atrocities with little moral conscience. By labeling Africans as savages, they could continue their brutal exploitation without fear of backlash, shielded by a myth that stripped Africans of their humanity and their right to self-determination. Today, the legacy of the savage stereotype still lingers. While modern Africa is home to vibrant cities, thriving cultural hubs, and peaceful communities, the remnants of colonial propaganda continue to color global perceptions. Many still see Africa through the outdated lens of violence and instability, a distorted image that blinds the world to the continent's true potential. However, the tide is turning. African leaders, creatives, and activists are challenging these outdated stereotypes and building a new, empowered narrative. Through the voices of African storytellers, a more accurate image is emerging, one where peace, innovation, and leadership take center stage. The world is beginning to see Africa not as the savage land of colonial myth, but as a continent of profound strength, resilience, and untapped potential. In the next segment, we'll tackle one of the most damaging myths still in circulation: the idea that Africa is a dark continent, devoid of culture, knowledge, and history. In reality, Africa's diverse cultures have contributed immensely to global civilization. Let's explore the myth of the dark continent and uncover the truth behind Africa's historical and modern-day brilliance. The term dark continent was coined by European explorers in the 19th century, largely out of their ignorance and lack of understanding of Africa. When they encountered unfamiliar customs, languages, and landscapes, they viewed these differences as signs of primitiveness. But in reality, Africa was home to civilizations that pioneered human achievement. From the pyramids of Egypt to the trade routes that connected great empires like Mali and Aksum, Africa was a beacon of knowledge long before Europeans arrived. Ancient Egypt, one of the oldest and most influential civilizations, was a cradle of learning and innovation. The Egyptians were pioneers in architecture, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. The construction of the Great Pyramids, which still stand as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, is a testament to Africa's intellectual prowess. Their knowledge of the stars, the Nile, and the human body shaped much of what we know today. In modern-day Ethiopia, the Kingdom of Aksum was a powerful empire, known for its architectural innovations and extensive trade networks. Aksum was one of the first to adopt Christianity, far earlier than many European nations, and had a unique form of writing. The Aksumites connected Africa to the Mediterranean, Asia, and Arabia, marking them as true global pioneers. The Kingdom of Mali was another brilliant example of Africa's intellectual and cultural achievements. With vast libraries and universities, especially in the ancient city of Timbuktu, Mali was a global center for learning in subjects like astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. The University of Sankore, founded in the 14th century, attracted scholars from around the world, showcasing Africa's intellectual depth. But Africa's contributions extend far beyond the ancient world. Today, Africa's cultural influence is undeniable. Artists like Burna Boy, Wizkid, and Tiwa Savage have taken Afrobeats to global stages, while African fashion designers are setting trends worldwide. Nollywood, Africa's thriving film industry, produces more films annually than Hollywood. Nigerian and South African filmmakers are telling stories that resonate across borders, showcasing Africa's diverse cultures and rich history. Films like Black Panther have brought African mythology and tradition to the forefront, reshaping global cinema. In technology, Africa is making waves. Countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa are leading in tech innovation. Nairobi's Silicon Savannah is a hub for startups that are revolutionizing finance, healthcare, and agriculture. Mobile banking in Kenya has transformed access to financial services, while tech entrepreneurs are creating sustainable solutions to address the continent's unique challenges. The philosophy of Ubuntu, which emphasizes interconnectedness and community, has found a global audience, influencing peace movements, corporate cultures, and social justice initiatives worldwide. The idea that "I am because we are" speaks to a shared humanity that transcends borders. African thinkers like Cheikh Anta Diop, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Frantz Fanon have shaped global ideas on race, identity, and colonialism, inspiring movements for liberation and equality across the world. Africa is not a land of darkness. It is a continent of incredible diversity. From the deserts of the Sahara to the jungles of Central Africa, from the bustling cities of Lagos and Nairobi to the tranquil landscapes of Cape Town, Africa offers a rich and multifaceted image. The continent is home to thousands of languages, cultures, and religions, each contributing to the vibrant tapestry of African identity. Far from being dark, Africa is a beacon of light, creativity, and resilience. Its influence has shaped the world in ways too numerous to count, and it continues to do so today. Africa is not defined by the myths of poverty, violence, or backwardness. Its true story is one of brilliance, innovation, and immense cultural wealth. The next myth we'll examine is one of the most pervasive and harmful: the lie that Europeans civilized Africa. We'll explore how this narrative was used to justify colonialism and how it has continued to influence perceptions of Africa's historical development. But the truth is, Africa had thriving systems of governance and culture long before the arrival of Europeans. Let's break down the myth of the civilizing mission and see the real story behind Africa's legacy. The myth of the civilizing mission was used to justify some of the worst atrocities in history. Colonial powers, particularly the British, French, and Belgians, framed their violent conquests and exploitation as acts of moral duty. In their minds, they were bringing order and progress to a chaotic, backward continent. But in reality, the civilizing mission was nothing more than a smokescreen for economic exploitation, land theft, and cultural destruction. European powers didn't come to Africa to uplift its people. They came to extract resources and enslave the population. Before European colonization, African societies were far from uncivilized. Take the Kingdom of Mali, for instance. Under the rule of Mansa Musa, the Mali Empire was one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the world. It had a sophisticated system of governance, with local councils and a centralized administration. Mali's capital, Timbuktu, was home to one of the greatest universities in the world, a center of intellectual and cultural exchange. In southeastern Nigeria, the Igbo people practiced a form of direct democracy long before the idea of democracy took hold in Europe. Their political system was decentralized, with decision-making shared among the people. The Igbo system of consensus-based leadership, emphasizing communal values, predated European ideas of democracy by centuries. The Ashanti Empire in modern-day Ghana had a highly structured and militarized society, with a legal system and centralized bureaucracy, managing trade, resources, and diplomacy. The Asantehene, or king, was elected by a council, and his power was balanced by checks and balances within the system. Even in the face of warfare, Africa's leadership systems were grounded in strategic brilliance, not mindless violence. Under Shaka Zulu, the Zulu kingdom grew into a formidable empire, uniting tribes through warfare, diplomacy, and military reforms that emphasized discipline and respect for the community. These examples are just a glimpse of the complex, organized societies that existed across Africa. The myth that Africans were savages in need of European rule completely disregards these well-established systems, their political complexity, and their cultural richness. Instead of civilizing Africa, Europeans brought destruction. They carved arbitrary borders that divided ethnic groups, fractured communities, and fueled conflict. They replaced indigenous governance systems with foreign-appointed rulers who lacked understanding of local cultures and customs. This disconnection from their roots led to a loss of identity, cultural autonomy, and social cohesion, undermining the very systems that had made African societies resilient for centuries. Colonial powers also plundered Africa's wealth, often using forced labor to extract precious minerals, crops, and animals. The stolen wealth fueled European industrialization, while leaving Africa impoverished and fractured. The so-called civilizing mission was, in fact, a brutal effort to exploit and dominate. Another aspect of the civilizing mission myth is the belief that Europeans brought progress to Africa, suggesting that the continent was stagnant before their arrival. But Africa had its own forms of progress long before Europeans set foot on its shores. The Great Zimbabwe ruins stand as a testament to Africa's engineering genius, an ancient city built without modern tools. The Great Rift Valley in Kenya, the birthplace of humanity, is where the earliest evidence of human evolution was found. These civilizations were constantly evolving, building, and contributing to the world. But these achievements were often erased from history by the colonial narrative. Europeans didn't bring progress to Africa. They interrupted Africa's progress, disrupted its systems, and replaced them with foreign ones that often did more harm than good. The so-called progress they introduced was designed to serve their own interests, not to uplift Africa. The myth of the civilizing mission continues to affect African countries today. The political instability, economic inequality, and cultural disintegration that many African nations face are often framed as inherent to the continent. But the truth is, these challenges are the direct result of centuries of colonial exploitation and disruption. African leaders today are working to rebuild what was lost, reclaim their identities, and strengthen their systems of governance. The real story of Africa is one of resilience, self-determination, and pride, not one of helplessness or inferiority. In the next segment, we'll address one of the most dangerous myths ever propagated about Africa, the idea of African inferiority, rooted in scientific racism. This lie was used to justify slavery, segregation, and the systemic oppression of African people. But the truth is, Africans have always been leaders in intellect, innovation, and culture. Let's uncover the pseudoscientific theories that perpetuated this myth and explore the lasting impact of these false ideas. The myth of African inferiority has been one of the most harmful and insidious lies ever created. For centuries, it has been used to justify everything from slavery to apartheid and modern-day discrimination. This lie, rooted in pseudoscience, was carefully constructed to convince the world that Africans were less intelligent, less capable, and less human than other races. But what if these so-called scientific theories were not just false, but deliberately crafted to serve the interests of colonialism and slavery? Let's break down the falsehood of African inferiority and the role of scientific racism in spreading this dangerous myth. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scientific racism became the tool to support European imperialism. Pseudoscientists like Samuel George Morton used craniometry, the study of skull sizes, to claim that African skulls were smaller than European skulls, and thus, Africans were less intelligent. These theories weren't rooted in actual science, but in deep racial bias. Even the theory of eugenics, used to argue that genetic superiority was tied to race, perpetuated the idea that African people were biologically unfit for civilization. But history tells a different story. African societies have always been centers of knowledge and intellectual achievement. Scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop shattered these racist theories by proving that ancient Egypt, far from being a foreign civilization, was an African creation, filled with advanced knowledge that laid the groundwork for Western science. W.E.B. Du Bois, a leading African-American intellectual, pushed back against these false theories, showing that racial inequality was social, not biological. Africa's intellectual legacy isn't just historical, it's ongoing. Take Nigerian-born Philip Emeagwali, whose work in supercomputing helped shape the future of technology. Or Dr. Denis Mukwege, the Congolese gynecologist internationally recognized for his groundbreaking work in treating survivors of sexual violence. African nations like Nigeria and South Africa are making strides in space exploration too, with organizations like NASRDA and SANSA contributing to global space research. The myth of African inferiority continues to be debunked by the incredible achievements of Africans, both historically and today. Despite this, the legacy of scientific racism still lingers. These damaging stereotypes continue to shape how African people are viewed, sometimes even by African people themselves, perpetuating economic inequality and social exclusion. This is why we must reject the myth of inferiority. Africans are heirs to a rich legacy of intellectual greatness. The rise of African voices in global culture, from Afrobeats to Nollywood to literature, shows the world that the myth is falling apart. Africans are claiming their place in every field, and the world can no longer deny their brilliance. The falsehoods of the past are being shattered by African excellence. The narrative is being rewritten, and the myth of inferiority is fading fast. Africans are not inferior. They are a powerful force shaping the future. Africa's legacy is far more than just a history of struggle. It's a story of innovation, strength, and resilience that has shaped the world in countless ways. As we continue to uncover these truths, it's crucial that we reclaim the narrative and celebrate Africa's rightful place in history. If you enjoyed this journey through Africa's powerful contributions to the world, be sure to subscribe to Africa Unveiled. Join us as we continue to explore, educate, and uplift the true story of Africa and its global impact. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Let's unveil Africa's greatness together.